The alarm screamed through the corridors of the Crimson Scale, jolting Captain Diana from her morning coffee. Her crew scrambled to their stations as the sensors picked up debris scattered across 300,000 kilometers of empty space. At first, she thought it was just another asteroid field breakup, nothing unusual in the Ashbourne Nebula. But then the scanners caught something else, something that made her blood run cold. Metal. Twisted. Scorched metal that had once been a ship. A human colony ship. Diana's hands tightened on the command console. She had seen plenty of wrecks in her 20 years of salvage work, but human ships were different. They were ghosts now, reminders of a civilization that had vanished from this sector decades ago after what everyone called the Great Silence. Nobody knew what happened to Earth or the core human worlds. They just stopped transmitting one day, and the scattered colonies slowly winked out like dying stars. "Captain, we're picking up a life sign." The voice of a navigator, a young dragon named Kyle, cracked with disbelief. "It's faint, but it's there. Human biosignature." Diana didn't hesitate. "Get us in close. Prepare the boarding team." Her first officer, a scarred veteran named Blake, stepped forward with concern etched on his reptilian face. "Captain, salvage rights are one thing, but rescue operations cost time and fuel. If it's been floating out here for days, the chances of survival are—" "I didn't ask for a probability assessment, Blake. Move." The boarding team found him in what was left of the ship's emergency shelter, a reinforced pod designed to keep someone alive for maybe a week if they were lucky. The boy looked about 5 years old, small even for a human child, with dark hair matted with sweat and eyes that were too wide, too aware. He should have been crying, screaming, breaking down. Instead, he just stared at them with an intensity that made seasoned warriors uncomfortable. Diana was the first to remove her helmet. The air in the wreckage was thin but breathable. She knelt down slowly, making herself smaller, less threatening. "Hey there. My name is Diana. We're here to help you." The boy didn't respond. He just kept staring, his small hands clenched into fists. "What's your name?" She tried again, keeping her voice soft. "Nothing." The medical scanner showed he was dehydrated, malnourished, but alive. Against impossible odds, this child had survived when everyone else aboard that ship had died. Diana saw empty cribs in the adjacent compartment, other children who hadn't made it. This boy had watched them die. That kind of trauma left marks that never truly healed. Back on the Crimson Scale, Diana's crew made their opinions clear. They had a schedule to keep, contracts to fulfill. Taking on a human orphan meant delays, complications, and expenses they couldn't afford. Dragons had their own families, their own problems. This wasn't their responsibility. But Diana had made her choice. She named him Jake because he reminded her of her brother, another stubborn soul who refused to give up no matter what life threw at him. For 3 days, Jake didn't speak. He ate when food was placed in front of him. He slept when exhaustion forced him to. But he watched everything, learning, adapting in a way that seemed almost unnatural for someone so young. On the 4th day, when Diana sat down across from him in the small cabin she'd converted into his room, Jake finally spoke. "Where are we going?" His voice was rough from disuse, but clear, direct, no fear in it, just a simple question demanding a simple answer. "Pyrath Prime," Diana said. "The Dragon homeworld. I'm going to find you a family there, people who can take care of you properly." Jake considered this, his young face serious beyond his years. "Will they eat me?" Diana couldn't help but laugh, though it came out sadder than she intended. "No, kiddo, dragons don't eat people. Well, not anymore. That's mostly just stories." She paused. "We're not so different from humans, really. We just look scarier." "You don't look scary," Jake said matter-of-factly. "You look tired." Out of the mouths of children came uncomfortable truths. Diana was tired. Tired of salvaging the remains of dead civilizations. Tired of finding nothing but corpses and memories. But this boy, this survivor, he was something different. He was hope, small and fragile, but real. When they arrived at Pyrath Prime 2 weeks later, Diana had planned to hand Jake over to the Social Services Division, let them place him with a suitable family among the court servants or outer settlements. But word of the human child had spread through the capital like wildfire. Humans were legends now, ghosts from the past. To have one alive, walking the halls of the Dragon Court, was unprecedented. High Matriarch Victoria herself summoned Diana and Jake to the throne room. The ancient dragon was massive, her scales like burnished gold, her eyes containing centuries of accumulated wisdom and ruthlessness. She studied Jake with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "This is the human child." Victoria's voice resonated through the chamber, making the air itself vibrate. "Yes, Your Majesty," Diana answered, her hand protectively on Jake's shoulder. Victoria descended from her throne, each step deliberate. She lowered her enormous head until she was eye level with Jake. Most children would have run screaming. Jake stood his ground, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Interesting," Victoria murmured. "Very interesting indeed." 15 years had passed since that day in the throne room, and Jake had grown into something the Dragon Court had never seen before. He stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching the young dragon nobles practice their aerial combat maneuvers. They dove and swooped through the air with natural grace, breathing gouts of flame that lit up the morning sky. He would never be able to do that. His feet were planted firmly on the ground, as they always would be. But that didn't mean he was helpless. "Still pretending you belong here, Ember Prince." The voice came from behind him, dripping with contempt. Jake didn't need to turn around to know it was Tyler, one of the most arrogant of the young dragon lords. The nickname had stuck over the years, meant as an insult, a human pretending to be something he could never truly become. Jake finally turned, his expression calm. "Just observing. You might want to tighten your left wing spiral. You're leaving yourself exposed to counterattacks." Tyler's face darkened, scales rippling with anger. "I don't need combat advice from someone who can't even fly. You're nothing but a pet project, a curiosity the High Matriarch kept around for entertainment." Others might have risen to the bait. Jake had learned better. "Maybe so. But I notice you still haven't beaten my scores in tactical analysis, or strategic planning, or political theory." He paused deliberately. "Or hand-to-hand combat, for that matter." The gathered crowd of young nobles stirred. It was true. Jake had spent 15 years absorbing everything the Dragon Court could teach him. While other students complained about studying ancient texts, Jake devoured them. While they relied on their natural advantages, Jake had to be smarter, faster in his thinking, more creative in his approach. He couldn't breathe fire, so he learned to wield plasma weapons with deadly precision. He couldn't fly, so he mastered terrain advantages that made flight a liability rather than an asset. His teachers had been surprised at first, then impressed, then occasionally disturbed by how quickly he adapted dragon philosophy to human capability. Master Bryce, the old weapons instructor, had once told him that he fought like a dragon who'd been cursed into a human body. Jake wasn't sure if it was a compliment. The trial of Ascension was announced 3 months before the actual event, giving the young nobles time to prepare. It was the most important rite of passage in dragon culture. Those who excelled in the trials earned positions of power and influence. Those who failed became footnotes in family histories. The challenges tested everything: individual combat prowess, strategic thinking, leadership under pressure, and the ability to navigate the brutal political landscape of the court. Jake had spent years watching the trials, studying them, noting patterns and weaknesses. He had never imagined he would participate. Why would he? It was a dragon ritual for dragon nobles. He was just a human ward, educated but ultimately apart from their hierarchy. But something had changed in Jake over the past year. He had watched mediocre dragon lords advance to positions of authority simply because of their bloodlines. He had seen talented individuals from lesser houses held back because they lacked the right connections. The system was breaking, becoming more about politics than merit, and everyone could feel the strain. When Jake approached High Matriarch Victoria with his petition to enter the trial, her council chamber fell silent. Even the gods stopped breathing for a moment. Victoria regarded him with those ancient eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. "You understand what you're asking? The trial of Ascension has never been open to non-dragons. Never in 10,000 years of our history." "I understand, Your Majesty," Jake said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "But your own laws don't explicitly forbid it. The ancient texts say that any ward of the court who has completed their education may petition to be tested. I've completed mine. The ancient tech assumed all wards would be dragons, growled General Raymond, one of Victoria's senior advisors. This is absurd. He'll be killed in the first combat round. Then that's my risk to take, Jake said simply. Victoria leaned back in her throne, a slight smile playing at the edges of her reptilian mouth. You've always been bold, young Jake. Foolish, perhaps, but bold. She was silent for a long moment, and Jake could feel the weight of her consideration. Finally, she spoke. Very well. I will allow it. But understand this. You will receive no special treatment, no accommodation for your human limitations. You will face the same trials as every dragon noble. If you fail, if you embarrass this court, there will be consequences. I understand, Jake said, bowing deeply. The news exploded through the court like wildfire. A human entering the trial of ascension. It was scandal, entertainment, and insult all rolled into one. Some of the older dragons were outraged, calling it a mockery of tradition. The younger generation was divided, some amused by the spectacle, others genuinely curious to see how far Jake could go. Diana found him that night in the archive, surrounded by tactical manuals and historical records of past trials. You know this is crazy, right? She said, sitting down beside him. She was older now, retired from salvage work and serving as an advisor to the court. Probably, Jake admitted, not looking up from his reading. They are going to come at you with everything they have. Tyler and his friends see this as an opportunity to humiliate you publicly. Let them try. Diana grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to look at her. Jake, I didn't save you from that wreckage just to watch you get yourself killed trying to prove a point. Jake's expression softened. I'm not trying to prove a point. I'm trying to show them that strength comes in different forms, that their system is big enough to include more than just one way of being. He paused. And maybe I need to prove it to myself, too. The first trial was individual combat. Jake drew an opponent named Cole, a mid-tier noble with more arrogance than skill. The arena was a circular pit surrounded by thousands of spectators, all eager to see the human fail. Cole had every advantage: size, strength, natural weapons, and the ability to breathe fire. Jake had his brain. The match lasted 4 minutes. Jake used smoke grenades and neutralized Cole's fire advantage, plasma nets to ground him when he tried to fly, and exploited the dragon's predictable attack patterns to position himself in blind spots. When Cole finally yielded, stunned and humiliated, the crowd sat in shocked silence. Then, slowly, some began to cheer. The celebration after Jake's third consecutive trial victory was still echoing through the court when the first explosions hit. One moment, young dragon nobles were congratulating each other on their performances. Servants were preparing the feast for the evening ceremony, and Jake was catching his breath in competitors' pavilion. The next moment, the sky turned orange with fire that wasn't dragon-made. The emergency sirens wailed across Pyroprime, a sound that hadn't been heard in over 50 years. Jake rushed to the nearest observation platform and felt his stomach drop. Ships were descending through the atmosphere, hundreds of them, their hulls black and angular like the carapaces of insects. The Vescari horde. He'd read about them in the military history archives, a species that consumed resources from conquered worlds and moved on like locusts, but they'd never struck this deep into dragon territory before. The sky lit up with defensive fire as the planetary batteries came online, but something was wrong. The coordination was off. Half the defense grid wasn't responding. This wasn't just an attack. It was a calculated strike that had been planned for months, maybe years. All nobles to the evacuation transports. The order came from General Raymond, his voice strained over the communication system. The High Matriarch commands immediate withdrawal to the secondary command center. Jake started moving with the crowd, then stopped. The Royal Archive, the ancient building, housed 10,000 years of dragon history, strategic databases, and most importantly, it was where the younger students and elderly scholars would be. In any evacuation plan, they were always the last priority, expected to shelter in place until military assets could be spared. But Jake had seen the attack patterns. The Vescari weren't just hitting military targets. They were hitting everything. He changed direction, sprinting toward the archive while everyone else ran away. The building was already in chaos when he arrived. Younger dragons, some barely 10 years old, huddled together in confusion. The scholars tried to maintain order, but many were ancient, their fighting days long behind them. The handful of guards present looked overwhelmed. "What are you doing here?" demanded Mitchell, one of the senior archivists. "You should be evacuating." "So should all of you," Jake shot back. "But nobody's coming for you, are they?" Mitchell's expression confirmed what Jake already knew. They were expendable in the larger tactical picture. Jake climbed onto a reading table, making himself visible to the frightened crowd. "Listen to me. We don't have much time. The Veskari will reach this building within the hour, maybe less. We can't outrun them, and we can't evacuate everyone quickly enough. So we're going to do something else. We're going to hold this position." "Hold it?" Mitchell looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "With what?" "Children and scholars against a Veskari assault force." "With intelligence," Jake said firmly. "This building wasn't just designed as an archive. Look at the architecture. Thick walls, limited entry points, defensive positions built into the structure from the old wars. It's a fortress that's been disguised as a library." He started issuing orders with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. The guards would hold the main entrance. Scholars who remembered their military training, even if it was centuries old, were positioned at key choke points. The younger students became runners, carrying messages and supplies. Jake had them barricade secondary entrances, set up fallback positions, and prepare the building's ancient but functional defensive systems that nobody had bothered to maintain properly. "This is insane," muttered one of the guards, a scarred veteran named Greg. "We should be falling back to defensible military positions." "Those positions are probably already overrun," Jake said, checking the plasma rifle he grabbed from the armory. "The Veskari knew exactly where to hit us. They've been planning this. But I guarantee they didn't plan for resistance here. We used that surprise." The first wave hit 20 minutes later. Veskari shock troopers, their chitinous armor gleaming, their mandibles clicking with alien communication. They expected to walk through an archive defended by confused academics. Instead, they ran into concentrated plasma fire from prepared positions. Jake's human military doctrine, learned from ancient Earth archives that the dragons had dismissed as primitive, proved brutally effective. The dragons fought with honor and individual prowess. Jake fought to win. He set traps, used ambush tactics, and coordinated fields of fire in ways that tradition-bound dragon guards had never considered. "Fall back to the second position," Jake ordered after the first wave was repelled. "Don't try to hold ground that's already lost. Make them fight for every corridor, every room." Tyler appeared during the second wave, leading a group of young nobles who'd been cut off from the main evacuation. His face was streaked with ash, his usual arrogance replaced with something closer to fear. "The main plaza is gone. The transport pads are destroyed. We're trapped." "Then you fight," Jake said simply, handing him a plasma rifle. "Welcome to the defense force." Something changed in Tyler's eyes. He took the weapon and nodded. The first day was chaos. The second day was grinding attrition. By the third day, everyone in the Royal Archive had become soldiers, regardless of their age or station. The young dragons learned that breath weapons were useless in close quarters where friendlies were everywhere. The scholars discovered that tactical knowledge from books translated surprisingly well to actual combat. And everyone learned that the human orphan they called the Ember Prince actually knew what he was doing. Jake barely slept, moving between defensive positions, adjusting tactics based on Veskari attack patterns, keeping morale up when ammunition ran low and injuries mounted. He treated a young dragon's wounds with field medical supplies, helped an elderly scholar set up a crossfire position, and personally held the east corridor when a Veskari breach threatened to split their defense. On the morning of the fourth day, when Jake was running on nothing but stimulants and stubborn will, the sound of dragon war horns echoed across the city. The relief fleet had finally arrived, recalled from distant patrols. The Veskari began their retreat, and the siege of the Royal Archive was over. When General Raymond entered the archive with his troops, he stopped in the doorway and stared. The building was scarred and damaged, but it still stood. Inside, exhausted defenders sat among the precious historical texts they protected, and in the center of it all stood Jake, covered in ash and blood, most of it not his own. "You held," Raymond said, his voice filled with something that might have been awe. "Against impossible odds, you actually held." Jake swayed on his feet, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "We held, sir. All of us." But Raymond was looking at him differently now, and Jake could see it spreading through the gathered troops. The human wasn't a curiosity anymore. He wasn't a pet project or an amusing novelty. He was a warrior who'd done what needed doing when everyone else had run. He was a leader. The throne room should have been full of life and ceremony, but instead it felt like a tomb. High Matriarch Victoria's body had been recovered from the ruins of the command center where she died in the first strike. The funeral rites had been completed 3 days ago, and now the Dragon Court faced something it hadn't confronted in over 2 centuries, a succession crisis with no clear heir. Jake stood in the back of the assembly hall, trying to remain invisible. He'd been asked to attend as a witness, a formality given his role in the defense. The seats around him were filled with noble houses, military commanders, and influential courtiers. Everyone wore the formal mourning colors. But beneath the ceremonial respect, Jake could feel the tension crackling like electricity before a storm. "The matriarch's direct line has ended," announced Chancellor Beverly, her aged voice carrying through the chamber. "Her daughters fell in the Eastern campaigns. Her son perished defending the evacuation routes. By ancient law, the conclave must now choose a successor from among the noble houses." What followed was a masterclass in political dysfunction. House Thornscale proposed their eldest lord, citing military victories from decades past. House Goldenwing countered with their own candidate, pointing to economic contributions and trade networks. House Stormbreak simply declared that their lineage was oldest and therefore most legitimate. Jake watched as days turned into weeks. Each session of the conclave ended the same way: deadlock. No house would yield to another. Pride and ancient grudges made compromise impossible. Meanwhile, the report from the frontier grew worse. The Vescari were regrouping. Pirate raiders were hitting supply convoys, sensing weakness. 2 outer colonies had declared independence, refusing to send tribute to a capital that couldn't even govern itself. "This is pathetic," Diana muttered beside him during one particularly bitter session. She'd earned a seat in the conclave through her military service, though she rarely spoke. "Victoria would be ashamed to see what we become." Jake nodded silently. He'd spent the past weeks helping with reconstruction efforts, trying to stay useful while the politicians bickered. But he'd also been watching, learning, seeing patterns that troubled him deeply. The Dragon Empire wasn't just facing a succession crisis. It was facing an existential one. Their rigid traditions, their refusal to adapt, their insistence that only pure-blooded dragon nobles could lead, all of it was killing them slowly. The breaking point came during the 7th week. House Thornscale and House Goldenwing nearly came to open combat on the conclave floor, stopped only by General Raymond's guards intervening. As the chamber cleared in angry chaos, Diana stood up. "We need to talk," she said to Jake. "Privately." They met in her quarters that evening, joined by General Raymond, Chancellor Beverly, and a handful of other senior officials who had grown increasingly frustrated with the deadlock. Jake felt out of place among these power players, but Diana had insisted he attend. "We're dying," Raymond said bluntly, dispensing with formalities. "Not from the Vescari, from ourselves. Every day without a leader, we lose more credibility, more territory, more unity." "The noble houses won't compromise," Beverly added, her clawed hands gripping her walking staff. "Each would rather see the Empire burn than bow to a rival." "So we forced them to compromise," suggested Commander Nathan, a fleet officer who distinguished himself in the recent defense. "Back one candidate with enough military support that the others have no choice." "That's a coup," Beverly said sharply. "It would trigger civil war." "We're already halfway to civil war," Nathan shot back. Diana had been quiet through this exchange, but now she spoke. "There's another option. One that none of you want to hear, but one that might actually work." She looked directly at Jake. "We nominate Jake for the throne." The room went silent. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "What?" "Think about it," Diana continued, her voice gaining strength. "He's a ward of the court, educated in our traditions. He's proven himself in combat and crisis leadership. But most importantly, he's not part of any noble house. He has no ancestral grudges, no political debts. The houses might accept him precisely because it's neutral ground." Is human, Raymond said, though his tone was more thoughtful than dismissive. We'd be asking the Dragon Empire to accept a non-dragon ruler. That's unprecedented. So was everything Victoria did, Beverly said slowly. She was studying Jake with calculating eyes. She broke with tradition when she made him a ward. She saw something in him that would dismiss a sentiment. Perhaps she were preparing for exactly this situation. This is insane. Jake finally found his voice. I'm not even. I can't. He struggled for words. I'm nobody. I'm the orphan you pulled from a wreck. The kid you kept around because Victoria thought it was interesting. I can't rule an empire. Why not? Diana challenged. Give me one reason that's actually valid. Because I'm not a dragon. And maybe that's exactly what we need right now, she said quietly. Someone who can see beyond our traditions. Someone who's had to work twice as hard for every achievement. Someone who understands what it's like to be an outsider and still fights the community anyway. Jake stood up, pacing to the window. Below, he could see Pirate Prime still scarred from the attack. Reconstruction crews worked through the night, trying to rebuild. Citizens moved through streets that should have been bustling with commerce but felt half empty. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath, wondering if their government would pull itself together or tear itself apart. I spent my whole life trying to honor the dragons who saved me, Jake said softly. Trying to prove I belonged here, that I was worthy of the chance Diana gave me. But claiming the throne? That's not honoring you. That's taking something that was never meant for me. Leadership isn't about bloodlines, Raymond said, his gruff voice surprisingly gentle. It's about being willing to carry a burden that nobody else can. About making impossible choices. You've already done that. In the archive, when everyone else ran, you stayed. You led people who had no reason to follow you, and you saved them. Chancellor Beverly tapped her staff against the floor. The ancient laws state that a ruler must be proven in fire and worthy of flame. It's poetry, really, open to interpretation. You were literally proven in fire during the siege. As for worthy of flame, she paused. The flame of leadership burns anyone who holds it, dragon or human. It doesn't discriminate. Jake turned back to face them. If I do this, if I even try, it'll tear the court apart. Half the nobles will see it as an insult. They'll fight it. They're already fighting, Diana said. At least this way, we're fighting for something that matters. For a future that's bigger than noble house politics. And what if I fail? Jake asked, what if I'm not strong enough, not smart enough? What if I make things worse? Then you'll fail as spectacularly as any dragon ruler who came before you, Beverly said with a slight smile. We have centuries of failed leaders in our history. At least you'd be an interesting addition to the list. Despite everything, Jake laughed. It was a short, slightly hysterical sound, but it broke the tension. He looked at each of them in turn. These weren't just political operators making a calculated move. They genuinely believed in this insane idea. They believed in him. If I agree, Jake said slowly, I do this my way. No puppet ruler. No figurehead while you pull strings. If I'm going to carry this burden, I carry it fully. We wouldn't want it any other way, Diana said. Jake took a deep breath. Outside, the twin moons of Pirate Prime were rising, casting silver light across the damaged city. Somewhere out there, the Vescari were planning their next move. The Empire was fracturing, and a human orphan was about to step into the fire. All right, he said, let's do this. The announcement of Jake's nomination sent shockwaves through Pirate Prime that were almost as destructive as the Vescari attack had been. Within hours, protests erupted in the Noble District. 3 houses formally withdrew from the conclave in outrage. Commander Nathan received death threats, and Jake found himself assigned a security detail of 12 guards who looked like they weren't sure whether to protect him or arrest him. But something else happened too. Letters began arriving at the palace. Thousands of them. From common citizens, from outer colony administrators, from soldiers who'd fought in the recent defense. They said things like, finally, someone who earned it, and maybe a human can see what we become. The people who had no voice in conclave politics were making their opinions known anyway. The conclave had no choice but to invoke the ancient trial of sovereigns. It was the only mechanism in dragon lore for settling disputed successions. 3 challenges, each designed to test a different aspect of leadership. Pass all 3, and even the most traditional houses would have to acknowledge legitimacy. Fail even one, and Jake would be dismissed, probably exiled to avoid further controversy. The first trial was announced at dawn, the Trial of Wisdom. Jake was led to a sealed chamber where 5 senior magistrates waited, along with representatives from each major noble house. On the table before him lay a scenario, a detailed brief of an impossible political situation. "You are the ruler," Magistrate Helen began, her voice formal and cold. 3 of your vassal states are on the brink of war over a territorial dispute. Each has legitimate claims supported by ancient treaties. Each has threatened to withdraw from the empire if you rule against them. Military force would spark a civil war. Diplomatic appeasement would be seen as weakness that invites further challenges. You have 1 hour to present your solution. Jake read through the brief carefully, his mind racing. This wasn't just a test of political knowledge. It was a trap. Any traditional solution would fail because the scenario was designed to have no good answer within dragon conventional thinking. They wanted to see how he'd handle impossible choices. He spent 4 to 5 minutes writing, then stood to present. "I reject the premise of the question," he began, and felt the room tense. The scenario assumes the only options are ruling in favor of one party or attempting neutral appeasement. But leadership isn't about choosing between bad options. It's about creating new ones. He outlined a plan that would have made traditional dragon nobles uncomfortable. Joint administration of the disputed territory by all 3 states. A new council system that gave each party guaranteed representation. Economic incentives that made cooperation more profitable than conflict. And most controversially, opening the disputed region to settlement by non-dragon species who had no stake in the ancient rivalries. "You're suggesting we dilute pure dragon authority," one of the House representatives said, his tone scandalized. "I'm suggesting we build something stronger than purity," Jake countered. "An empire based on shared interest rather than enforced loyalty. You can have an empire of dragons that tears itself apart over ancient grudges, or you can have an empire that includes dragons and grows beyond what any single species could achieve alone." The magistrates conferred in hushed tones. Finally, Helen spoke. "Your solution breaks with 10,000 years of tradition." "Tradition built an empire," Jake said quietly. "But tradition alone won't save it. The Veskari don't care about our ancient treaties. The universe doesn't care about bloodline purity. We adapt or we die. That's not human wisdom or dragon wisdom. That's just truth." After a long pause, Helen marked something on her tablet. "The candidate passes a trial of wisdom, though not all of us agree with his methods." The second trial came 3 days later, the trial of strength. Jake was led to the combat arena where he'd fought during the trials of ascension. But this time, his opponent was Tyler, the young noble who'd once mocked him as the Ember Prince. Tyler had volunteered, and everyone knew why. This was his chance to publicly humiliate the human who dared reach for the crown. The rules were simple. Single combat, any weapons or tactics allowed. Fight until one combatant yielded or was incapacitated. Tyler had size, strength, natural weapons, and the ability to breathe fire. Jake had plasma weapons and his wits. The fight was brutal. Tyler came at him with everything, using his flight to attack from angles that were nearly impossible to defend. Jake's shoulder got burned when he barely dodged a fire blast. His ribs took a hit that cracked at least one of them. But he'd fought Tyler before, knew his patterns, knew that the dragon's arrogance made him predictable. Jake led him into a pattern, trading ground for positioning, absorbing hits but never quite breaking. Then, when Tyler committed to what should have been a finishing aerial dive, Jake rolled aside and brought his plasma staff up in an arc that caught the dragon's wing joint. Tyler crashed hard, unable to fly. Jake was on him immediately, plasma blade at his throat. "Yield," Jake said, breathing hard. Tyler's eyes burned with hatred, but also something else. Respect, maybe, or at least acknowledgement. "I yield." Jake helped him to his feet, an act that clearly surprised Tyler. "You fought well," Jake said quietly, so only Tyler could hear. "Better than last time. You've been training." "Lot of good it did me," Tyler muttered. "It did you more good than you know," Jake said. "I'm going to need people like you if this insane plan actually works." Dragons who care enough about their home to fight for it, even when they hate the changes coming. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Cheers from some quarters, stony silence from others. But nobody could say Jake hadn't earned his victory. The third trial was the one Jake feared most, the trial of fire. It was both literal and symbolic. The candidate had to walk through the sacred flame, an ancient chamber filled with plasma fire that burned at temperatures that would instantly kill most species. Dragons were naturally resistant, their scales providing protection. Humans had no such advantage. Diana found him the night before, her expression grave. You don't have to do this. We can claim religious exemption, argue that the trial isn't applicable to non-dragons, and forever be seen as a leader who couldn't complete what every dragon ruler before me completed. Jake shook his head. No, if I'm going to do this, I'd do it fully. No asterisks, no exceptions. You'll die, she said bluntly. Human flesh can't withstand that heat. Maybe, Jake acknowledged, or maybe I'll find a way through. I've gotten pretty good at surviving impossible situations. The day of the trial, the sacred chamber was packed. Every noble house, every important official, thousands of citizens who demanded to witness this moment. The flame itself roared in its ancient containment field, a corridor of fire 20 meters long. Jake stood at the entrance wearing minimal protective gear. Anything more would be seen as cheating. The heat was already overwhelming from 10 meters away, making his skin feel tight and his eyes water. Chancellor Beverly performed the ceremonial blessing, her voice steady despite her obvious concern. May you be proven in fire and found worthy of flame. Jake stepped forward. The heat hit him like a physical wall. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, but he forced himself onward. 1 step. 2. His skin was burning now, actually burning. 3 steps. 4. The pain was indescribable, beyond anything he'd experienced. Halfway through, Jake's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, the flames roaring around him. Through the pain, he could hear voices shouting, people calling for the trial to be stopped. But the ancient rules were clear. Interference meant automatic failure. Jake thought about the wreckage where Diana had found him, about the dead children in the cryopods, about 15 years of proving himself over and over again, about the people in the archive who trusted him to lead them through impossible odds, about an empire that was dying because it refused to change. He stood up, 1 foot in front of the other. The smell of his own burning flesh made him want to vomit, but he kept walking. 8 steps. 9. His vision was narrowing, consciousness starting to slip. 10 steps. The exit was visible now through the flames. Jake emerged from the sacred flame and immediately collapsed. Medical teams rushed forward, but Chancellor Beverly reached him first. She stared at his burned arms and face, at the patterns of fire had left across his skin. "The mark," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The prophecy mark." Jake was barely conscious, but he heard the gasps rippling through the crowd. The burns across his arms and chest had formed patterns that looked almost deliberate, swirling designs of the ancient text called the Mark of the Bridge-Maker. A prophecy so old that most dragons thought it was just poetry, not prediction. 3 days later, Jake stood before the conclave, his burns healing but the scars permanent. The vote was not unanimous. It never would be, but it was decisive. Jake was crowned Emperor of Pyrith, the first non-dragon to wear the crown of embers. His first act was to restructure the empire into a federation where all species had representation. His second was to redirect military resources toward finding the lost human colonies and rebuilding contact with his people. His third was to establish the archive defense as a permanent institution, honoring those who'd held when everyone else ran. The empire would never be the same. Some called it the end of dragon greatness. Others called it the beginning of something better. Jake just called it survival, and got to work building a future worthy of the price he'd paid.